What up, guys? So as you can see, the beard is really coming back in. I know a lot of y'all gonna be proud of me for how quickly I'm growing this thing back out. You can already kind of pull some hair down there. It's coming, it's coming. But anyways, I just wanted to make a video real quick. I'm gonna try not to take a lot of y'all's time because I know y'all don't like watching a lot of videos, even though I know you really like listening to Mr. Robinson talk, and you probably missed that in your life. So I'm gonna give it to you. The What I wanted to talk about is how the Republicans in the post Civil War got labeled as radical Republicans, and that word radical, the way it's used, we hear it. I think a lot of times you hear it today in reference to like radical Islam, would be terrorist organizations that have ties to the Muslim faith, right? And it's pretty much always considered like a negative term, right? But I think this term radical is just one that gets put on any group that's doing something outside of the norm. So, like, yes, terrorists who are claiming the Muslim faith should get that term radical put on them because they are outside of what most Muslims do, right? Like most Muslims are not terrorists. The vast majority of Muslims are not terrorists, right? The same thing with Christians or with any faith, really. Like the vast majority of people who practice faiths aren't terrorists, aren't wanting to do bad things, right? But that term also gets put on people who start questioning the norms, right? So, for instance, a lot of you guys know that there was a long time period where I did a lot of work around helping the homeless in Houston, and we would bring food and water to homeless people in Houston, and did that for years, right? And people loved hearing about that. People loved hearing the story about like, oh, we brought this food down to these people and they were hungry, or we gave these guys water, whatever. They loved hearing those stories. They didn't like so much when I started asking like, why are there so many homeless people? What is it about our society that accepts that there's so many people living on the streets? So when I started asking these systemic questions, people started saying, well, you're kind of a radical, and so whenever you start to question the norm, whenever you start to question what most of society is accepting as okay, then people are going to label you as radical. And that's what kind of happened with these Republicans, right? Because they weren't going to just accept like, okay, the war's over, slavery's over, so let's move on. Because I think these people, and I'm sure they had their own flaws, but in the as far as the issue of reconstructing the nation goes, reconstructing the nation after the Civil War, they understood that if we just let the South run their same states, they weren't going to give black people voting rights. They weren't going to make it to where these formerly enslaved people had any way to continue or to build lives, right? So remember, we've talked a lot about that promise of 40 acres and a mule. We talked a lot about that throughout this school year. And there's some other videos in this PowerPoint that will show you that why that didn't become a reality or whatever. But ultimately, people who were enslaved, it was like, okay, you're free, now what? And so the radical Republicans were saying like, well, we have to give these people educations because most of them the vast majority of them for their entire lives had been denied the ability to learn to read. They were denied any kind of education because it was actually illegal in many places to even teach an enslaved person to read, even if you were a slave owner, to teach the people that you had enslaved, to teach them to read was illegal in many states. And so they said like, look, we can't just say like, hey guys, go figure it out, because they don't have anything to build with, right? And so the radical Republicans said Reconstruction has to force the people in the South to allow black people, the formerly enslaved people, to build some kind of equity and to somehow be get to a place where they can be equal to the people who were white. And so they wanted to implement a lot of things that would do that, and they had started doing that, but ultimately Reconstruction kind of ends because Andrew Johnson doesn't fully get impeached. The same thing happened to Andrew Johnson that happened to President Trump recently. He was impeached by the House, but then the Senate voted by one vote, which is even closer of a vote than President Trump's was pretty close as well, but they voted by one vote to not to impeach Andrew Johnson finally. So he was impeached by the House, but not convicted by the Senate, which is the same thing that happened to President Trump, which is also the same thing that happened to President Bill Clinton in the 90s. So Reconstruction was something that had to happen after the Civil War, and there were a group of Republicans that said, yo, like, the South needs to pay reparations for what they've done to these people. The wealthy landowners in the South need to do their part to ensure that their wealth that was built by these people that they've had enslaved for so many years, to ensure that those people now have part of that wealth, right? Like, some of that wealth needs to be redistributed to these people because it's not yours. Like, you had free labor building it. It belongs to the people that helped build it. But these ideas were labeled radical, right? And so there's lots of ideas that people have about making our society more equitable, making our society a place where everyone has an equal opportunity to learn and to grow and to just to live their lives, right? And a lot of times, if those ideas come outside of the norm of what we're already accustomed to, they get labeled as radical. So I just wanted to make this video just to kind of make sure that when you guys see that word, that you don't automatically associate it with something bad. Because I think people that put that term onto people often mean it to be negative. But as I've said to you guys over and over this year, we have to be careful and pay attention to how people are using language and why they label certain people and certain things in certain ways, right? So make sure you're always paying attention to that, and know that the radical Republican, the ideas that they had weren't truly that radical. Their ideas were logical. Their ideas made sense. To say that wealthy white landowners who had built their wealth on the backs of enslaved people who had got no share of that wealth, to say that some of that wealth needed to go to those people, that's not a radical idea. That's an idea that makes sense. It gets labeled radical because the truth of the matter is that the people who hold the wealth in a society don't want to give that up. And so even though we had already fought a war to make them stop slavery, we may have had to fight another war if we were going to tell the wealthy white landowners to give up some of their wealth. And it's a shame that the government never did it. And you may hear people talking about reparations is something that's been talked about more and more recently. And that's because you had people who were enslaved for so long, for generations, for hundreds of years in America. People were enslaved, right? And then when you say, and while that was happening, the white landowners are building wealth on the backs of this free labor, which we've talked about a lot this year, right? And so to kind of end that, to end slavery, means more than just to say, hey, I can't force you to work for me anymore. It now means some of that wealth that was built on the backs of these people needs to be given to them. And so people are talking about that even now, that the descendants of enslaved people in America should receive some sort of reparations to level the playing field. Because right now it's not level, because you still have, even though slavery was ended almost 150, a little over 150 years ago, you still have, remember, those families that already had generational wealth that was built on the backs of enslaved people. Well, now here we are generations later, and do you think those families just gave up their wealth? Well, maybe. Some of them may have, but I think for the most part, each generation, they've built on it. So you've got families and you've got generational wealth that's been in the hands of white people in America for so long that there's a lot of people saying, you know what, some of this needs to be spread out a little bit because it's not fair that people who acquired and maintained that wealth through unjust means get to hold on to that wealth. And so that's an idea, reparations, that is considered radical. Is it a radical idea? I don't know. I'll leave that up to you to decide. Would love to see some comments on that, whether on your worksheets or on this post. But I love y'all. Hope everybody's staying safe. Stay inside, or at least keep your distance from people. And hope to talk to y'all soon. Peace.